Welcome, I'm Mark James. I'm the Interim Director for the Institute for Energy and the Environment and an Associate Professor of Law here at Vermont Law School and an Associate Professor at the Maverick Lloyd School for the Environment. I think that's all my titles. And I'm very happy to moderate our panel here. This is it. I think when I got to law school at a later age, I realized how much I enjoyed just being in class and learning things. And this panel is another opportunity for me to get to figure out how to make my class better and how we can all sort of do that and continue to change and evolve how we teach and what we teach to better prepare our students to go out and be the advocates that we had a chance to hear from earlier today. That we don't teach law in a vacuum, that we now have, I had students who cover the whole STEAM variety: science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And I've also had students that I didn't come to law school to learn about numbers. They came to avoid it. Well, they're not going to be able to avoid it much longer. So that's what our panel is going to talk about today, is to prepare the students for the type of questions that they're going to see after they graduate. So think about how we can teach numerical and scientific literacy in our classrooms, building skills, building comfort with interacting with different disciplines, so that you're able to engage with them and feel like you are participating and hearing your clients. And it could be a whole range of things that we'll talk about today, from market design, scientific methodologies, economic analysis, modeling, things that you will see as a practicing attorney in environmental law, or admin law, which is, I just learned, is the real environmental law. So we have three panelists. We have three wonderful panelists who are going to guide us through how they integrate numbers, and stats, and economics, and science into their classes. So we have Ed Richards, who is the Clarence W. Edwards holds the Clarence W. Edwards Distinguished Professorship.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. All right, correction.
Hey.
Emeritus now.
Professor, we'll just skip to the point and send a note about let's update bios. Professor Emeritus and Senior Fellow of the Climate Change Law and Policy Project at Louisiana State University in beautiful Baton Rouge. You can go and find their bios. I think they're mostly correct. We've learned some corrections to do here. We have Steph, who is a professor of law at UW-Madison School of Law, as well as being the Associate Dean for Education and Faculty Affairs at the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. So, teaching in the law school, administrating in the School for the Environmental Studies. And we are at the end joined by Lisa Heinzerling, who is a professor of law at Georgetown. You still hold the Justice, Brendan? Good, got that part correct. And who has done significant work. We've already heard her shouted out today about her work on economic analysis and looking at discount rates and cost-benefit analysis, and bringing science and economics into the classroom. So everyone's going to kind of go through. They have their own areas that they work in, and one of the things that we talked about was thinking about how do you go about picking the issues that you want to talk about, how do you find the materials that you would like to use to convey that. I think it's helpful for us to think about that. As a member of our assessment committee, how do you go about assessing people on what they do know, and being able to pass that along, and just thinking about this as a chance to explore different pedagogical approaches to bringing numerical and statistical analysis into the classroom, that there is no single way, and often it is tailored around the type of work that you're going to do and the type of experience and expertise that you bring into that. So with that, we will start with that. Ready to go there?
Well, I started working on these materials when I was invited, and it really caused me to try to think about what it is I've been doing since I've been teaching science in classrooms for a long time to a lot of different kinds of audiences. Most of my work has been around science and law. And so I had about 6 hours worth of material. And then I was reminded I had 15 minutes. So this may be a little more philosophical, but I'm going to put some more practical materials into the persistent materials that will come out of this. So, I'm a kid growing up in the 50s and 60s, born in 50s. I'm a science geek. Mr. Wizard, Jacques Cousteau movies, Bell telephone movies. If you haven't found it, there's one of those in the 50s talking about climate change. It's actually pretty good. The Sea Around Us, Rachel Carson before Silent Spring. The other thread is remembering that science has always been controversial. Scopes trial, Galileo, and then whatever our latest ones are. So I've never had a complete notion that there was a good old days with this. Now, in my experience with law students, I don't get very many of them with physical science backgrounds. Or much math, but more critically physical science. The other problem I have is, of course, the rest of the law school curriculum, where we drill into people that you got to think like a lawyer. There is no truth, only ambiguity to exploit for your client. And as a mentor to the few science students I find, I spend time trying to remind them that you got to forget about truth or you're just going to be screwed in law school. The codes of professional practice encourage this. So we were joking at dinner last night. The only thing you really learn as far as ambiguity is if somebody's going to jail, make sure it's the client. Experts are seen as hired guns. There was a more pejorative term we used to use, but not a good term to use. And I've done some writing over the years on, what's the duty in hiring an expert? Well, it's to get someone that tells a story to support your client without openly suborning perjury. It's not to find the truth. And there's a whole industry that supports this. And environmental lawyers are absolutely as enamored of junk science as anybody else when it supports their story. And those of you who know me from the environmental law list know I raise this issue occasionally. And the really best advocates, to use a colloquial phrase from the old days, are high on their own supply. Not only do they make the advocacy arguments, they believe them with the clear eye of a zealot in front of the juries. Sociopaths do this better than anyone. Some of you may have run into them in your working careers. So I'm trying to make a little sense of what I do in the classroom, and this has really caused me to think about this. I think it's really that I want the students to understand the notion of objective truth as represented by science, and that's a critical thing for them to appreciate when we're trying to, and this is mostly in the context of climate. This talk is mostly in climate. It'd be a little different if we're talking about toxicology or other areas. That there is an objective truth, but it's not, but you can have an objective truth that's not an immutable truth. And that's really important for dealing with climate uncertainty. Some of this is talking about the real world scientific process. Not that old scientific method stuff about hypothesis and testing hypothesis and survey design. That's what you do, certainly. But understanding that there's a lot of critiques of climate science, and they're not all incorrect. There are holes of knowledge because science is expensive, and you have to find someone to pay for it. And the funders call the tune. They may not dictate your results, but if you don't find results that are consistent with what they want, they won't continue to fund you. We see this a lot in the area I did the most work with on coastal work and coastal restoration, where the money is perpetuating the myth that you can restore the coast in the face of sea level rise. Scientists are people, subject to bias, greed, ego. I've written a bit on human experimentation law over the years. In some ways, ego may be even more dangerous than greed in some of the scientific world. Peer review is imperfect. Reviewers are people, they're biased. Reviewers have their own agendas. So being published in a peer-reviewed journal isn't proof of truth, but it's the starting point. But I really want the students to understand that at any moment in time, some new paper comes up. That's the starting point. Is it going to be replicated? Will other results build on it logically? Will it persist through time? That when you're going to read a study, you've got to have some fundamental knowledge of the subject. You have to read it in context, and you have to be very critical in your reading, be very skeptical. I was very skeptical of climate science for a while until I dug into it fairly deeply and could begin to sort the wheat and the chaff. So I want to sort of have this progression. Talk about what I call non-probabilistic facts, which is just stuff we know. Stuff that's not controversial. Might have been, at one point, freezing point. Water, particularly. Water's magic. A lot of talk about water magic in my class because that's what makes life work. That's what drives the climate. That's why we're not just an ice ball in space. Freezing point, specific heat. Decrease in density with freezing. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas. Those are just physical facts. There's no debate on those facts. The chemistry of dissociation of CO2 in water, how that leads to acidification. Objective facts. And I actually go through an exercise in class where I start out with a rock in empty space. And I talk about what would be the temperature of the rock. What about on the sunny side? Well, we're not far out in space, there's no sun yet. We put in a sun. Now we've got a hot rock on one side and a cold rock on the other. We start adding atmosphere. We build ourselves a planet using these and some other basic facts to get a sense about how this is stuff we know, there's no question about, and this is how these systems work. You know, things like greenhouse gases, they're products, they're physical products of absorbing and re-radiating radiation. Give the students a sense that there is a lot of hard factual evidence that takes you a long way. We also spend time talking about the the astronomy stuff, the Markovitch cycles, and the other things that affect warming. Then we look at geology, which is how we know about climate cycles. And in geology within the context that you have a lot of physical facts, like where the rocks are and what the rocks are made out of and how the rocks are layered, but it's fundamentally models that try to explain that. And we learn from those models. We have useful things from those models. Things like we can find oil. The lower Mississippi Delta is probably the most geologically characterized chunk of the Earth, not because there were a whole bunch of people really excited about Delta geology, because you find oil there. But we learned a lot. We learned about climate cycles that are reflected in the river, flooding cycles. So we learned that there are models, but they're fairly refined. They have real world results. We can check them. They help us understand the past. And the facts they're based on are fixed. We can maybe have more data about geology. But on the other hand, these models change. Within my lifetime, when I was an undergrad student and took geology, that probably would have been in '71, there was a raging controversy over continental drift and continental plates. John McPhee has written a whole series of books on the transition of geology in the 60s to 70s, accepting that. That didn't change a lot of things like where to find oil, but it fundamentally changed our notion of geology. So even these models are refined and changed through time. Now, I pick one of I really look hard at sea level rise and the geology, because that's, again, if you're teaching on the coast, it's really a way to make the case and show all the different geologic reconstructions about what happens with sea level rises and why that inexorably eats deltas and wetlands and beaches. And they migrate inland, and then they migrate back out when the ice accumulates again. So we bring it home. In my context, if I were teaching in Maryland, I'd be talking about the Chesapeake Bay. You know, bringing it home to the local environment and the local problems. Then we get to the hard part, the uncertainty stuff, where we have uncertain data. Unlike geology, we have uncertain data, data about the future, data that's changing through time, and we have uncertain models. We talk about weather, and there's a wealth of first-rate short videos on YouTube generated by science educators. BBC's got a bunch on all of these problems. They get a lot of at-home assignments to look at videos on these little short videos on different issues. That weather is a highly nonlinear system, meaning little changes make big differences. And when the system changes from one little change, then all of your previous predictions kind of begin to fall apart until you get the next little change. And that the models are still being refined. The biggest advance in weather is computational cost. The weather models get better as we can do more computation on more points and more weather data. There's just been maybe a breakthrough, maybe smoke and mirrors about machine learning based model. It's been in the news in the last few weeks. But we can see with weather that we see the models improve based on the length of the window you can make a prediction. It wasn't that many years ago that 5 days out was really uncertain. Now we can get 7, and on some phenomena we can get almost 2 weeks out. The cone of uncertainty for hurricane paths has been narrowed dramatically over the last 25 years. But these are still imperfect models. That weather forecast, like for this afternoon, it doesn't say at 2 o'clock it's going to rain buckets. It says there's a 60% chance. And maybe that chance will include buckets and hail. And that's the best model we have of a big, complex, nonlinear system. And that takes us to climate models. And this is the hardest part I want to try to get them to understand, because I have 2 focuses in the course. One of which is having them understand why people don't believe in climate or climate change. And I'm not talking about it here, but I have the very first thing we read in class is paper on cultural cognition and tribal affiliations and scientific belief and scientific information. Get it out on the table, because some of my students don't believe in climate change. So we go through, what do we know? We get back to our physical facts. Number 1, the easiest way to know the Earth is warming is sea level rises. That is, except for major changes in the deformation of the ocean floor, which happened a few billion years ago, sea level only rises when the Earth warms. It's just a thermometer. And we can work through, and we do work through, all the things that affect the temperature of the Earth. That's where we get into the planetary cycles, solar cycles, all of these things. And those aren't changing consistent with the warming. We know greenhouse gases are increasing, and we know that from physics they will warm the atmosphere. So I help lead them through how it's a process of elimination to decide that anthropogenic greenhouse gases are what's warming the atmosphere. But then we get into the lawyer part, because there's a lot of uncertainty. You'd never succeed in court in this if you really were litigating whether climate change exists. How much? We don't know the amount of warming per unit of greenhouse gas. We get closer to that number. Check back in 50 years, we'll have a pretty good one. More critically, we don't know how much and how fast sea level will rise. We know that with the current warming today, we're probably going to see more than 2 meters of sea level rise. Makes a lot of difference whether it's by 2100 or 2500, but we don't know which it is. And every year we get better data. But that's a huge uncertainty. And if you're a planner in Florida who's working under DeSantis, you're going to look at one side of that uncertainty. The IPCC always is a lowest common denominator because it's a consensus model. They all underestimate this, and we spend a lot of time reading IPCC documents. Rain and heat patterns are changing, highly uncertain. Talk about attribution science, but it's still only percentages. Houston has had a series of catastrophic rains in the last decade. Baton Rouge has had a few. Those are made more certain to happen by climate change, but all we can say is a certain attributional increase. Nothing is ever, that's because of climate change. Hot here, but look at the historic record. Hottest, we're only now breaking records set in the mid-30s for both drought and heat in a lot of parts of the country. Now we're going to continue breaking them, but really getting the students engaged with, if you're a climate denier, there's a lot of uncertainty. And in a lawyer model, that uncertainty is very effective in undermining beliefs. So I think I'm out of my time.
You heard. A couple minutes. No, like minute and a half left.
Okay. So by the time I'm done, I want them to be able to talk to someone who doesn't believe and explain why they think climate's changing. Now, the other part of the class is counseling clients about climate change who don't believe in climate change. And we read through the foreign policy for flood insurance. You look about how you manage insurance risks, how you manage other risks, mostly related to catastrophic wind. We read insurance cases and catastrophic flooding, because that's the problems they're going to face. Now, those have to be problems that are pretty widespread, but I want them to be able to sit down with clients and address these needs. Typically on exams, I would give an exercise where they would write, say, a law firm's plan on doing business in New Orleans in light of what we learned for Katrina. Or we have a class devoted to if you want to stay in Louisiana, you want to live in New Orleans. I'd like to live in New Orleans. What should your plan be? How do you think about it? Do you buy real estate? What kind of insurance do you need? What's in your go bag? What do you need to know about your firm so if the city floods, you know you're still in business? And that really makes this real to them, because some of them lived through it. Now they're mostly old enough now that they're just little kids, but their parents lived through it. And these are very present experiences. And I was down in Baton Rouge for Katrina and Rita. It's the real lived experience. And I think that makes this more effective to them in how to actually take something from our class and use it in their practice. How's that?
That's perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And now we'll hear from.
So I'll take my slides down.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Right? There should be a mute. Oh, that's fine.
Yeah, me will do it, but.
Okay, so I won't focus on just climate change, but I think Ed laid out the groundwork really well for how sort of my part of the talk, which will deepen some of the sort of more structural kind of things that I think we can teach about science in environmental law classes. So this is going to be talking about lots of different kinds of areas. For example, toxics, for example, water and hydrology. But the main thing I think that many students who don't come from STEM backgrounds don't totally get is the methodology of science, right? They think that science is magic, you come up with an answer. Ed laid out how there is a lot of uncertainty involved, and I try to sort of lay out structurally what kinds of uncertainties are involved. So one of the things that I try to mention is that there are limitations to scientific research. There's the budgeting issue, right, that Ed talked about just now. You can't study things infinitely without some kind of infinite budget. Sometimes students will be like, well, why don't we know the full health effects of XYZ? Well, one, that takes money to study. Two, it takes a lot of environmental effects are very long-term effects. Climate change has a long-term kind of effect, but so do many types of toxic exposures, so do many types of, like, say, groundwater, sort of groundwater movement. A lot of these the timing of it can be such that in order to have a fully fleshed scientific study to understand something, it would take a very long kind of longitudinal study. And so I try to emphasize that too, that the timing of these studies makes it difficult to magic it out. And the longer the study, the more expensive it's going to be. The other thing too is the human subject's nature of it. Now, humans are hard to study for a number of reasons. One, because it's unethical to experiment on us. We did do that at some point. That was not considered good. And so we just created this whole system of institutional research boards to try to contain any desire to expose people to toxic substances, to have a test group and a control group. So we can't do that. So what do we do instead? A lot of times what at least public health people have to do is rely upon natural experiments, right? So looking at a population of people who have been accidentally exposed to a bunch of stuff versus a population of people who haven't been accidentally exposed to a bunch of stuff. Now, what's the tricky part in that? Well, when these are long-term effects, identifying backwards who's been exposed to that stuff at a certain point in time is difficult, right? So you have to do sort of forward-looking kind of things and track forward, right? Their kind of health effects. And that takes time again, and also makes things more expensive. Moreover, everyone doesn't react the same way to any kind of exposure, right? There are things that are called confounds, right? So if you have other types of health effects, it might make the exposure to certain kinds of toxins much worse. If you are, say, have some kind of reproductive capacity, you might have different kinds of effects. And sometimes just natural genetic variation can lead to different effects, which is why any kind of large population study can only result in these sort of percentage-wise things, which is difficult, makes things difficult for a lot of these sort of toxic tort cases and sort of class action suits that we like to idealize as sort of remedying some of these sort of exposures. And so all of these lead to some difficulties in just finding the science that might render the causality certain. So what does that mean for understanding environmental law? I try to get students to understand this in the context of sort of, private tort law, where sometimes these sort of standards for causation are quite high, versus the regulatory kind of state, right? Where you can use this less as a sort of demonstration in court that you've proven some kind of causality for exposure, but rather, the sort of risk kind of exposure that may lead one agency to create a regulation to address that risk, right? Rather than sort of the causality kind of methodology. The other thing that I mentioned too, and try to get students to be aware of, is that there are many different types of studies, right? So there's the longitudinal studies that study long-term kinds of exposures to things, but then but each of those studies themselves might look at different populations in different areas, and so there's things called meta-studies, which most law students have never heard of, that try to accumulate those studies and sort of come up with some kind of synthesis of them. I also try to talk about some of the limitations of those, because there is a lot of judgment call in terms of determining which studies to count, which studies don't, but I try to make them aware of these different types of studies out there so that when they are trying to understand the data for themselves, they can sort of weigh this in their head. The other thing I try to emphasize is that science it's not homogeneous. Each individual scientific discipline has different norms for peer review, and Ed mentioned peer review, but different disciplines will have very different approaches to sort of what they consider okay in terms of peer review and what they don't. For example, I've worked with representing climate scientists and as Amici in the past, and also hydrologists and wetland scientists as Amici in the past. Climate scientists are much more cautious, at least in their scientific publications, about what they try to state, probably because they've been attacked so much, but they bring this out in peer review. But hydrologists are kind of like, ooh, we can go out there. And it's very different. And then I think students don't necessarily understand that each discipline has has its own variety, right? In the same way that, different types of legal practices have their own sort of standard practices. And the only way to understand that is to really do a deep dive into them. The other thing too, that I try to juxtapose, well, first let me get into modeling. Ed mentioned modeling a lot, and I think a lot of times students don't necessarily understand how modeling works. So I work with general circulation models when you get to sort of climate change stuff in grad school, but I also work with ab initio quantum models. And the way that these models work is that they tend to get refined, as Ed said. And how does that work? Well, you test it against reality, right? And the less it reflects reality, the more you say, okay, we need to reconsider these relationships. And so this develops over time, and a lot of times these models don't just rely upon testing against reality and doing these things, but also on a lot of other individualized smaller studies. There's a whole scaffolding effect to building models that I think students should be aware of, and they draw from a lot of different disciplines. So I bring up, different kinds of ways in which sort of oceanographers and sort of air circulation scientists and stuff have worked together to contribute to these general circulation models. And the same thing happens with sort of like, say, wetlands kind of models for habitat reconstruction or not reconstruction. All of these kinds of things are things that you take a lot of disciplines in there and they try to contribute to that model. And to the extent that that model works or doesn't work, it depends on a lot of these underlying studies and the sort of ways in which the people creating the models accurately sort of incorporate these. And that, again, is what peer review is ideally for, right? Say someone creates a new model or extends a model. The idea behind peer review and the idealized idea of peer review is that the peers can critique the sort of potential models, and they might be able to suggest, hey, look, you're missing this thing. You forgot about this study, blah, blah, blah. It's my study. That's always the joke for peer review, is that people try to do self-citations out of it. But aside from that, putting in these additional studies that might have been missed might be a way to make a particular model more robust. The ultimate part is to emphasize that science, at least as ideally constructed, is supposed to be a team effort, right? It works as a team effort with critiquing things and bringing in different disciplines to build a better understanding of the world, if not a perfect understanding of the world. That said, there's a lot of meta issues around it, right? So scientific funding can mean that certain areas of science get explored or not explored. Certain commitments, for example, I've seen, this is outside the environmental context, but I guess there was an early commitment to a certain mode of development of Alzheimer's that is being questioned now, but peer reviewers have canceled it out for a while because they're like, that's kind of outlier. And so this can happen, and students should be aware of that as well. But what the important thing is to look for, right, is the types of critiques that are out there and to evaluate that. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I think it's important to juxtapose this against the dismal science or economics, right? Because so many times these will be put together in the same kind of, for example, regulation, right? You have a proposed regulation, they've got the scientific background behind it, they've got the economic justification or lack of justification thereof behind it. And what's often, and this is why I mentioned the norms of the disciplines, what's interesting is that, at least in most scientific STEM disciplines that I have been familiar with, uncertainties are widely reported, which is why science seems so uncertain to the layperson. You try to characterize the uncertainty, you try to do that, and if you don't, you get knocked off in peer review. Not so much the case with economics. It's not as much the norm. So what it looks like to a layperson is, ooh, this is crystal clear. You just popped everything into a calculator. But that's not how they do it. They just don't evaluate the uncertainties. There's a different way that a lot of times economic models try to capture uncertainty. And the way they do that is to run models with different assumptions. And then they show the range of those assumptions. So it's a different way of thinking about it. But I try to characterize that for students so that they don't think, okay, well, economics is crystal clear. Rather, their norm for presenting this variability is a norm in which they run a bunch of models with different underlying assumptions, like, for example, that the cost of gas is going to rise at this rate versus this rate versus this rate. And they have A, B, C, and they model that in the sort of costs of some proposed regulation, which is very different, right, from the way that scientific models, physical scientific models work. And there is less, and again, I might be biased here because I'm a former STEM scientist, but there's less of an attempt, although more of an attempt now, to match up those models with the actual outcome of events. Now, one branch of economics has criticized this for a while, but those classical economics economists have been the sort of behavioral economists who said, well, look, your models aren't actually matching. You want the real world to fit your models, not the models to fit the real world, and that's not generally how science works. There has been a movement to change things, but I think that at least compared to the physical sciences, it's much more mixed. Again, biased on this, so you should take that with a grain of salt, but I think it's helpful for students to understand the norms of these different disciplines. So that's the two main things that I wanted to bring up with respect to sort of the background context for economic research, STEM research. The other thing too that I think is helpful for students to understand is that there are resources out there for attorneys. So in doing so, I surveyed a bunch of friends who work at law firms and said asked how they get experts, talked to friends at government. There's a lot of different ways whereby you can find those experts, because students are going to be like, well, I don't know how to find those experts. If you're at a big nonprofit, you're probably going to have those experts to work with. And the main challenge there for you is to be able to sort of translate your legal questions, like, okay, the standard under the Clean Air Act is blah, blah, blah. What's the relevant science on that? And to be able to convey that to your experts so that they give you valuable information. But if you are working for a small firm and you're trying to represent some kind of company that needs to comply with some kind of permitting kind of thing, how do you find that? Well, one easy way is consulting companies. Other ways can be LinkedIn, and I know a lot of folks who use LinkedIn and recommended experts from similarly situated attorneys. These are all things that are resources out there. There are also resources for just generally looking at things. So the Federal Judicial Center has a bunch of resources for federal judiciary, including this handbook for science that gets updated about every 10 years. This can be also a resource if you are just a general legal practitioner who wants to dig into kind of an issue. The National Academies of Science is often consulted to do the foundational work for rules development. And so you can look at their reports, and they're all out there for free, at least the PDF version, not the paper version. And then you can look at those and sort of get at least what the assessment of experts qualified under the Federal Advisory Committee Act have said is the sort of consolidated understanding of that area. And so that too is a resource that I try to tell students about, so they are aware that they don't have to go at it alone when they start to practice. The last thing that I think, and then I'll stop after that, is that to the extent that you are at a place where you can get cross-enrollment from STEM students or other environmental studies students, I so recommend that. I've been teaching environmental law and natural resources law at University of Wisconsin now since 2006, and we usually get graduate students from our environmental studies program. And they talk to each other. I have a lot of exercises designed where they're forced to talk to each other, and so the lawyers will be like, oh, so that's how you find out how this Superfund site is leaching into there. You're doing this and this and this, huh? Didn't know about it. And then the students would be like, oh, that's why you hire consultant groups. I guess we just always thought you wanted to find out, just for niceness sake, what the environmental effects of a project is. You mean it's to comply with the law? And they're like, yeah. So they learn a lot from each other, and they learn a lot. And I think that it forms a better appreciation of both science on the part of the law students and law on the part of sort of STEM students. So I would highly recommend that if ever possible. So that's pretty much it. I will end now, and we'll get to Q&A later.
Thank you. Great job.
Oh, thank you. I think we teamed up pretty well.
So you can just go back and forth.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk about a specific form of economic analysis, and that is cost-benefit analysis, and how, at least I teach it. Just one way to teach this kind of analysis. So I wanted to start by just saying, why would you include this in an environmental law class? They're already crowded. There's so many statutes, so many concepts. Why would you include it? And I'm going to give you several reasons. One, executive orders. We heard about 12866 this morning, era executive order requiring agencies to conduct cost-benefit analysis for the very most important rules and send them to the White House for approval. Those executive orders have existed since at least Reagan, maybe even Nixon, and required cost-benefit analysis of important rules. And most administrations have been pretty strict about this, right? And indeed, it's one of those mysteries of the political system in the United States that presidents, Democratic and Republican, have adhered to the system of White House review of agency rules according to the criterion of cost-benefit analysis, just across political philosophies, regulatory philosophies, even when the assumptions of cost-benefit analysis are at cross purposes with their policy aims. Right? It's a bit of a mystery. It broke my heart when President Biden stuck to it this time around. We've had in the last couple of administrations of Democratic presidents, we've had a moment when we thought maybe both they would loosen the grip of the White House on rules, which if you teach administrative law, it's really an important piece of the process to teach, and also maybe loosen the grip of cost-benefit analysis. But that didn't completely happen, although I'll talk about a couple of adjustments. All right, so executive orders, the regulatory process includes this. A second reason is that courts have gone from a place where they tended to think that environmental statutes didn't allow consideration of costs, right? Forbid it, certainly didn't require it, to requiring it. And this is the most famous example of this is Michigan versus EPA on an air toxics rule for power plants some time ago. So that you're going to increasingly run into this, even outside the executive order. And then last, I just think cost-benefit analysis raises really fundamental questions about environmental protection. One is, to what extent do we want to protect humans? Can we look them in the eye, so to speak? And it's complicated as to whether we do that. I'll talk about that in a minute. But can we say, we are quite sure that 1,000 people will die if we don't enact this regulation, but you know what? It's not worth it. And why is it that we conduct that analysis and sometimes say, no, it's not worth it, and don't see the moral quandary that's present in that choice? Right? That's just an interesting question, is how do we conduct that analysis in the face of what we think of, as we've heard even today, is a paramount commitment to protecting the public health. Secondly, how much, my co-author Frank Ackerman did a book called Can We Afford the Future, which I thought was darkly hilarious, which is just like, how much of the future do we afford? How far in the future do we look? How much does it matter? And when you're combating climate change, you are operating under the premise that it matters a great deal. And yet some of the operations of cost-benefit analysis undercut that premise. So I think it just raises quite fundamental questions about what we're doing in environmental law. So I am not an economist, and I'm going to talk to you about teaching cost-benefit analysis, and you can be sure that what I say to you is very, very simple, and anyone can do it, right? No matter what you come to the subject with. I started looking at cost-benefit analysis years ago because I ran across a table. I was interested at that time in all of the concepts around regulating risk. And every darn article had this table that showed the cost per life saved of life-saving regulations. And they ran up to hundreds of millions of dollars per life saved. And you'd see it everywhere. And I thought, man, if that's true, then maybe our priorities are kind of wrong. Maybe it is true that we could do something else and save more lives with the money that we're spending on these lives. And so I looked into it. Wow, that was an education. What I discovered is that table was all about an operation called discounting, and that the analyst had directly discounted lives saved in the future, usually lives saved from cancer, long latency periods, had discounted them over 10%. I'll get to this in just a minute. But the idea was they became tiny. The benefits became tiny. So any amount saved that it cost would be a huge dollar per life saved. And so when I saw that, I thought, I need to be able to actually read these documents and to understand what they're saying, because they're incredibly influential advocacy pieces in the environmental law and policy community. Right? So that's sort of my pitch to you, is at least get to the point where you can say there is something fishy here, and either I'm gonna, like I did, devote 6 months to figuring out what it was, or ask somebody else. But to get to the bottom of it, I think is really important. So what's my basic approach to teaching is to keep it as simple as possible. It's almost, I almost feel sheepish being up here because I'm giving a talk as if like I'm some person expert, but it's unbelievably simple. So I cover 3 concepts: quantification, monetization, and discounting. For the quantification part, I think it is useful to do some of the thoughts about quantitative risk assessment that Steph talked about. I think that's and that David's work has covered some time ago, right? But excellent work. And so to just have that be a piece that is not about economic analysis, but of course is required, because the cost-benefit analysis I'm talking about is really quantitative cost-benefit analysis. It's not looking at a set of goods and bads and kind of eyeballing them. It's really quantifying each of them and then comparing the columns at the end of the day of benefits and costs. So then I turn to monetization, and here I focus on human life. That's the most salient of the benefits of environmental protection. It's often for air pollution rules. This is the benefit that really packs a punch in cost-benefit analysis, because the numbers are pretty big for the value of life, or statistical life, as I'll say in a minute. And so a lot of air pollution rules really do well, actually, at this point in cost-benefit analysis, because they usually involve particulate matter in some form, and that kills people. So yay! The cost-benefit analysis comes out excellently in those cases. So often we will say the value of a human life, but that nomenclature is misleading. And let me explain why. I have exhumed some PowerPoint slides from about 20 years ago, and you'll see I kept the actual font and the color the same. Remember these days when we do stuff like that? Sans or no, whatever it is, Comic Sans, yeah. Something like that. Anyway, okay, so just think about this scenario. How much fun? Here we have Tom. Okay, perfectly. It's all market transactions, right? That's the world we're in. Everything can be converted into a market transaction. Gee, Tom. Okay, so if you try to measure the value of human life, and you do it from the perspective of willingness to pay, right? Or willingness on the part of the person to accept the bad outcome, then 99% of people, maybe 100% of people are going to say, I don't take the deal, right? And I'd worry about the other 1%, you know? Truly. And so they're not going to take the deal. So you can't measure it, right? Because it's going to be infinite. It's like no deal. Okay, well then let's convert it to a different question. How much would you willing to pay to avoid certain death, right? Okay, same basic idea. Right? So then what do you get? You don't get a measurement of the value of life. You get a measurement of the amount of money that Bob has, right? It's all about willingness to pay all the way down. I mean, ability to pay all the way down. So this was a conundrum until they invented the statistical life, right? So let's not talk about human life anymore. And by the way, let's leave that on the cutting room floor, because actually we're never going to measure the human life, value of a human life, right? We talk as though we do, but we don't, because of the conundrum we're in. So here you go. This was 100,000 people in this big stadium. They're all willing to kick in. They all face a 1 in 100,000 risk of dying. In particular causes is all very simplistic, obviously. And they're each willing to pay $1 to avoid the extra risk. And they say, yeah, right? All told, they'll pay $100,000 to save one life, right? In that simple example. And somebody is happy, but we don't know who that is, right? And so that's the statistical life. It's not a life at all, it's risk. We've glossed over the problem of valuing life, and we're just valuing risk. And I think it's worth getting this across to students. Again, it's not that difficult, but it really raises some of the fundamental questions, I think, for students to try to grapple with those really interesting, really important questions. That's all I have for the slides. So I know you're so sad. The second thing I try to do, this is the valuation part, and then I do a lot of sort of asides about strange things. Like if we talked about lead, for example, we talked about lead this morning. In EPA's cost-benefit analysis of lead, there's weird reversals. What's a cost, what's a benefit? So if you don't lose IQ points due to lead and you get more education, is that a cost or a benefit? It's complicated. But EPA has long, I don't know if it's changed, but has long viewed it as a cost, right? Because you're spending more money on education, so that's got to go in the cost column. Incredible, I think what you might say is, the point I'd raise here for you at least to get your students to begin to think about is, its values all the way down, right? Fundamental values all the way down in cost-benefit analysis. So the last thing is discounting. This is the most complicated for students. I feel like I'm crystal clear about it, and I'm not. People always end up confused. And one of the things I'm tempted to say to them is something I say to students who are dealing with a kind of a question that's important and an answer that doesn't make sense, is I try to tell them, you are not confused. This may not make sense, right? This may not make sense. So the idea is, if you think of discounting, the simplest way to think of it is compound interest in reverse. Compound interest is magical, wonderful, because you take a little bit of money now, and later on, you have a lot more money, right? And you haven't done anything. You just sit there and you have a ton of money, right? This works the other way. You look into the future, you say we have a big benefit, maybe we're saving a bunch of lives, we're preventing a bunch of illness, all to the good, and then you discount it back to the present, so compounding it in reverse all the way to the present. And so the magic of discounting is it makes something really good and big seem like nothing today, right? And so that it takes away what I regard as one of the fundamental purposes of environmental law, which is to protect the environment and human health into the indefinite future. In other words, there's not a cutoff date by which we say, oh, we don't care anymore, we don't want it anymore, it's enough already, right? And so what the discounting has this kind of inexorable quality, just like compound interest, but in reverse, where it just keeps making those benefits smaller every year we wait for them to arrive. And mostly, and this again is so simple, but mostly if I can get that across to them, that's kind of enough. There are a lot of words, economists say, around how to measure the discount rate, exactly what it should be, how it should differ across periods of time, and so forth. But the basic idea, a premise of it, is that the future is kind of worth less than today. People will be richer, maybe, not clear anymore with climate change. Money will produce more tomorrow than will if we spend it today, right? So there are lots of premises that are kind of feel like, especially in the context of climate change, are very questionable, right? And that kind of undo some of the basic premises of environmental law. And so I end up teaching discounting, but again, with a quite light touch, and just to get some of these basic concepts. So another, two more things. One, just to say, we heard this morning about new policy guidance on cost-benefit analysis in the federal government, and there have been some inroads on some of this, this tendency. One of the tendencies of cost-benefit analysis, which I didn't mention, is to ignore distributional effects, right? To put those aside and say, oh, we worry about those elsewhere. We don't worry about this in this. And that comes from the basic theoretical premise of of cost benefit, which is that you're trying to achieve something called Calder-Hicks efficiency, which is that happy state that occurs when you have winners and losers in a certain public policy situation. And the winners win by enough, let's just say, so that they could compensate the losers. Do you see that? It's a very fancy way of saying the benefits are bigger than the costs, right? So something like that, or they outweigh the costs. They could compensate. They have enough left over in benefits, they could compensate the losers. And here's the trick, they don't have to. So everybody winds up as losers or winners, according to the cost-benefit analysis, with nobody compensating anybody for the loss. And that was a big problem. It is a big problem. And there have been a little bit of an inroad, and I just don't know enough this early on. It's pretty new guidance as to how it'll work out. But they've tried to make adjustments. Ricky Rivez and his team have tried to make adjustments to the way of looking at, in particular, looking at the willingness to pay and to making adjustments for wealth. They've also lowered the discount rates. To me, the philosophical premises remain inconsistent with a lot of the policy agenda of this administration. So last point, I think it's really helpful to have a legal context, not just to have a plain old economic analysis day freestanding in environmental law, because it's grounding. Because it gives people a sense like, oh, I see where this plays. I see how important it is, or I see how it works. So I'm going to give you 3 possibilities. 1, you should cover, but I won't browbeat you. But the White House process of regulatory review, it's like a whole different branch of administrative law. So that's one possibility for covering it there, thinking about it there. Another one is when the inevitable challenge to the social cost of carbon that has been estimated in this administration comes, I believe it will come, then that's another possibility for inserting what I'm talking about into legal doctrines. And then last, and this is so intriguing, is the most recent challenge, or not most recent, but a recent challenge of our Children's Trust has been to federal policies on discounting and their inconsistency with the Equal Protection Clause. And the notion is that discounting from the future in this way, of course, disproportionately disadvantages the population that has the longest to live, basically, right? And that has nothing to say about in the political system. And so that might be an interesting place for you to insert legal analysis in this area. The case is called Genesis B. And that's it. Thanks so much.
Wait, so on the note of how much would you pay to,
Yes.
give up your life? You haven't seen the horrible Gen Z memes out there.
Oh, no.
There are so many Gen Z
Really?
laughing suicide memes.
Why
posted
haven't
by
my
Gen
children
Zers.
told me?
They'll compare all the
I see.
different.
I
They'll compare
know.
the different generations, and they're like, no, and then the Gen Z is like, yeah, and it's all about death.
I'm sorry.
I know. Sorry.
We have 20 minutes for Q&A. I would take, there's always the moderator's prerogative, but I'm willing to throw that away for a good first question if anyone has something burning that they want to ask.
Well, I don't know if it's a good question.
They're all good, they're all good.
I have a question, and it's, thank you for this was really informative. I guess this question's for everybody. Could you talk a little bit about if you have particular class exercises or homework assignments or something that you give the students to have them sort of work through this? You spoke a little bit about how you contextualize it in the law, but I'm just trying to think for myself how I would, as a practical matter, have them work through this besides theoretical
So I always have students read one draft regulation and comment on it, and then go through, because all the draft regulations have the scientific background, the cost-benefit analysis, all that, and just go through that. And while I let them write their comment however they want, from their own perspective, I do get them to sort of do an analysis of those sections so they understand how the agency is struggling with it, and how also to reflect upon how, if you're a challenger, how you might challenge that, or if you're a supporter, how you might further support that.
I show them a movie called The Regulators. And if you don't know about it, you should find it out. You should Google it and find it and watch it. It is a documentary done by, I think, Frontline in 78, 79, eventually broadcast in 80, about making rules under the Clean Air Act amendments provision that dealt with the vistas in the national parks. And it actually goes through, don't ask me how, it's Carter administration, they got permission to sit in agency planning meetings with the scientists, the lawyers. They're sitting in the precursor to OIRA meeting. Jim Tozzi, who sort of starts the OIR process, actually is sitting in the corner. And it shows them arguing about these things and about how they make these decisions and what's going on. That's the best thing I have seen on getting a sense about, even though it's, God, how many years old now, how the interplay of the rulemaking process and the values and the fights that go on with that. Well, I don't have them write comments, but we pick apart the reg on, well, we can either use Clean Power Plan or some reg. We've got the cost benefit, we've got the legal justification. We parse it out in class, look at all of the pieces of it so that they're reading regs. I give them briefs to read, pleadings to read. We do this in the context of the kind of a document a lawyer would do, how you'd make the arguments, how the Fifth Circuit will never let you have standing, and just to get them into the exercise of what this means as a lawyer as opposed to a law professor.
Thank you.
Those Superfund exercises are also really good for that. Like in terms of splitting up the costs and stuff, you just have different private parties say, okay, well, how would you look at the sort of, if you're all contributors to a Superfund site and you contribute this chemical, you contribute this chemical, you contribute this mix of chemicals, how you would look into the types of mix of chemicals, the amount of pollutants, how you would trace that and make the economic and scientific arguments to your contribution in terms of negotiation.
They like arguing with each other.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a couple of good problem-oriented books. Todd Adgar's book just comes to mind, where they've got exercises. There's one in the various participants to the Chesapeake Bay pollution reduction, and there's roles for them to play fighting, so their state can maximize the crap it puts into the bay.
I do like ones where there are multiple parties, because that is really how a lot of environmental law works.
Right, and
one
they have
versus another.
And it's all of them have different interests.
Yeah.
If anyone in the audience has a great assignment that they do, you can highlight them too. So we're here to take as well.
We do. I designed an environmental justice negotiation for our clinical class, where we're using examples of CAFOs as kind of the grounding thread for the disparate topics that we address within our clinic seminar. And the final thing that they do is an in-class negotiation where they're taking different roles, but we assign them different roles of different environmental groups to show the tension that is often present in our own communities over the potential trade-offs, the potential benefits, thinking about distributional effects and whose voice needs to be magnified, things like that. And that's just a more complicated wrinkle, I think, to some of the traditional negotiation exercises, and one that leaves the students really kind of dizzy at the end, trying to get their head around the fact that there could be infighting and things.
Yeah.
That's a good idea, because in also Hawaii, there's often conflict between environmental groups and the appliance groups, for example.
thank the panelists for their personal experiences. I have a STEM background, and sometimes I just sort of punt and say, well, okay, here's how carbon dioxide molecule absorbs infrared radiation and it can bend and stretch. But that's just for your interest, and it's just sort of amusing. But the one area, and Lisa mentioned this, where I feel as if I can't let them off the hook, is in quantitative risk assessment, because that's so important to all of these statutes. And I still remember when I first started teaching this material, I put up a dose response curve. At the time there weren't these sorts of slides, it was on the blackboard. And I got audible gasps from the students. And, as if, well, you can't possibly expect us to know this sort of thing. And, my sort of knee-jerk reaction was, and you can't read a graph? So I still haven't really solved how to present quantitative risk assessment in a useful way. I took a graduate course at another institution in quantitative risk assessment, and it helped me a lot, but it didn't help me really teach it, because it's just more and more complex the further you go. So I was wondering if anybody had any experiences with that, because it's just so, you can't for students that are quantitatively challenged, when they come into the classroom, I don't know exactly what I can do, not just to make them more comfortable, but to get them to actually work with these numbers. So maybe people have suggestions. I'd appreciate anything you can offer.
I do simple stuff there too.
I was wondering, how it worked with your approach, because I would think the philosophical framing would be the best way to get them into this. When you start posing this as some sort of basic sort of values question or philosophical premise, then it might be enough of a hook to get them to engage with that. Because you're right, they should be able to read the graph.
Yeah.
So to me, it isn't necessarily so much a question as their inherent ability to engage with it, so much as this sort of a psychological block. Oh, I'm a law student, you put numbers up, right. I don't do numbers. So.
Well, there is the ultimate old-fashioned response, which is you tell them it's on the test and they better figure it out.
Right.
Although in our consumer-oriented world, that's not very popular.
You don't have to know how CFCs destroy the ozone layer. I'll tell you, but you don't have to reproduce it. Got it.
Yeah, I have to be clear to the class that we're going to go through this process, but they're not going to have any chemistry on the exam.
I think that too, it's nice to have a legal context. I don't know how you introduce it, but I often use the benzene case, because you can easily sort of almost teach against what the court did and assume the position it took, and I don't teach them on cost benefit or quantitative risk analysis in any meaningful sense, but I do teach both.
And Wendy Wagner has some good critiques of the way that's been.
Oh yeah. I think through the critiques.
Yeah.
I'm curious about your thoughts on where in the curriculum this kind of instruction would ideally happen. So, I teach a climate class, and I'm very reassured to hear you talk about how hard it is to teach the discount rate and have them understand it, because I also feel like I gave it my best shot and I came out the other end, and I don't think they got it. And there's just so many foundational skills, we'll talk about this in the climate affinity group next for people who come to that I feel like I have to cover in order to teach basic climate law, whether it be economics or various quantitative risk assessment, modeling. And in some ways I wish that I could require them to take a prerequisite before they take the class. And so I wonder, do you think that some amount of this should be covered in the basic environmental law class? We recently created a quantitative analysis requirement for our master's policy students, for at least the ones focusing in climate, and it's new, so we'll see. But I don't think many of our law students are going to be opting to take it, we'll put it that way. But I think they'd do so much better in all of the environmental electives that we have if they did. So where do you think it belongs?
Can I make a more global complaint about law schools, which has plagued me for the odd decades I've been in them, having come out of a different environment? It's the lack of prerequisites. It's the lack of structuring logical curricula. It's the complete hit or miss. Most schools don't require students to take ad law, but teaching environmental law without students knowing ad law, you're going to have to teach some ad law. That if you were serious about this and you had straightened resources, then having fewer courses that are sequenced would teach students a hell of a lot more. A basic ad law class is really a good place to do your cost benefit. I mean, in ad law, we look at that study you're talking about, and we look at the critiques, because cost benefit cuts through everything in ad law. There's a website of the history of OIRA and a bunch of things about regulatory budget that you can use, but you can't duplicate that. You can't then teach it in environmental law, or you can't teach it in climate change law. Coming out of program with chemistry, wherever you go, get a chemistry major. You're going to take a certain set of courses in sequence, and you're not going to waste a huge amount of time in courses repeating what they should have had in other courses. Vermont might be the place to do it, where you've got a environmental sciences unit that is one of your required early on courses. You do ad law, you do environmental science, you get the tools to then take the specific courses, because otherwise all the courses are so much weaker than they could otherwise be. I could teach 30 or 40% more in any of my classes if I didn't have to teach them ad law in the process, just as a perennial example, as an ad law nerd.
Yeah, no, I do find that annoying as well. I mean, I do try to incorporate like a brief introduction into, pretty much like whenever there's a case that involves something like that, I try to give an explainer about that. And oftentimes I have to repeat it throughout the course because quantitative risk assessment is going to come up in a few different contexts. So I try to bring it up in that kind of fashion, but I do think that there are other ways to go about it. So UW used to have a environmental law certificate, which died because of reasons unique to Wisconsin, where we have a diploma privilege, but to get the diploma privilege, you need to take a certain number of credits, which pretty much killed all the certificate programs because they couldn't do all of that at once. But now the university has been like, okay, well, we're going to revive certificates and just put a sustainability certificate in, and that's in our environmental studies program. So students are getting interested in that, and that does have the quantitative requirement. So if they want an extra badge that they have more sustainability in their background, they can take this sort of combined social sciences, STEM science, whatever, mixture of classes in the grad program in general to meet that certificate. And I think that actually works slightly better than doing it within the law school, given our diploma privilege-ish things. Yeah, but I think there's a lot of different ways to do that. I know that some schools have, say, accounting for lawyers, and that might be something where we could consider having, an environmental science for lawyers and just structure something like that. And that would be really neat to have as a sort of general kind of thing. I know that there's a handbook of hydrology for state judges that's out there. That's actually put together by water scientists around and water science societies around, and that explains everything pretty clearly. And I don't see why we can't have some kind of thing like that for environmental sciences. We just need people to come up and put it together.
In general, I find in my classes, I like to get into the class as soon as possible, really into the middle of it, and instead of a lot of background stuff, because I don't know how much they absorb of the background, and I'm not as excited by it necessarily. Maybe that's but it's partly, I think they're taking that class usually, I think, to learn the law, right? And so I try not to do a lot of other background, certainly not at the beginning, because I just think it works to intersperse it and to meld it into the law.
I have seen before, I've had professors who would do the background stuff as a recorded lecture, and if you do it, it's available early in the semester, and they're like, okay, 20-minute chunks or 10-minute chunks, and that's what it is. And if you want to go back and look at all the chapters, you can. If you need to refresh on 2 or 3 of them, then you're able to do that. But if you're going to create a system where you have an expectation of people coming into it, you still need to have, I think, materials to throw back to them that they can come and look at it. Or there's straight supplemental stuff too. One of my questions was Ed and Steph had both pointed out that there are materials you can go and look at if someone says, I still don't get it. Like I sat through your class, I've done the readings, asked questions, and I still don't get it. Can you point me to something else? It's a question I get a lot, especially as we deal with energy regulation and markets. And there are great 7 to 10 minute videos that the Regulatory Assistance Project puts out, and I'd be like, go watch that. You can watch this, and then we can come back and talk about that. So if people have good scientific or economic things where like someone has sat down for here's one term, and let's talk about how that works for 5 minutes. Be happy to take any of those suggestions because they're very helpful for that. It's kind of like a evolved version of the Khan Academy where people can go back and look at various things.
The students really like the videos, and they can go back and watch them. It's more oriented towards the way they think about things.
Just share one thing that I've done in the clinic seminar that we have that students have given me sort of surprisingly positive reactions to, which is we put up either a Clean Water Act or a Clean Air Act permit, and we just spend the hour puzzling it through. What does this provision mean? And then sometimes you get students in those discussions who have the technical background, they may have the environmental science background, and so then they start to explain it, and it's more of a discussion. And that can be effective, because that's very much what happens in practice, right? You get a file or you get something, and you have to puzzle it through and sort it out. So sometimes doing that together collectively has been effective.
When you say put it up, do you mean you post the whole thing?
We have them look at it beforehand, and then we put it up on the screen and we go through the different parts of it. So there's something they like about puzzling through this stuff, even if they're not so inclined to be the STEM person and have the encyclopedic knowledge of it. So anyway, that's an interesting reaction. I wasn't expecting them to like it as much.
They're just always desperate for what looks like real lawyer stuff. And that looks like it is real lawyer stuff.
So one thing, for some reason, this seemed to work to get students to be less scared of risk assessment, is to take it out of the regulatory context and say, look, you are a new tech company, you're a lawyer for a new tech company, you're trying to do this green tech thing, but you're worried about litigation involving some potential risks. How do you negotiate a package with a litigation insurance company? And then I have people do the litigation insurance company, and they're supposed to do their own risks to assess the packages. And for some reason, talking about it in that context is not, I don't know why it's less scary, but it may be because they associate insurance with risk already, and that's normal. I don't know. I don't know why that works, but doing it in the context of insurance is okay for some reason.
Did you have a question or comment, Michelle?
Well, I was just curious, I taught environmental law for the first time this last year, and, in trying to talk about uncertainty, in the middle of dealing with one of the statutes, we pivoted to talking about the adequate margin of safety language, and looking at, you're going to set a standard, an air exposure standard, air quality standard, or a water quality standard at a certain level with an adequate margin of safety. And then, so I'm thinking about how you translate that into more discussions of uncertainty or risk analysis, and how you think about the economics and cost benefit analysis for that additional layer of safety, and I don't know, I just love to hear your musings on that topic.
I often use that example in the risk assessment context as well. I've gone back and forth over the years over a couple of them. And that and you could then pair it, I don't always do this, but you could then pair it, because then you have, at the end of the day, you have some estimate of risk. And it often will be both death and illness, and then you can think about what can you say about the monetary value of those different consequences.
And our class discussion really focused on, how does this comport then with that, with the major questions doctrine? If you're thinking about doing something that is beyond the specific explicit mandate of the statute, but is still within that ambit of, the buffers that you're supposed to be able to provide, then, is that a way of addressing the major questions doctrine? And what kind of, support would you need to be able to demonstrate that, to a court or to lawmakers or, in the regulatory process?
So I might bring this up in the context of, and this is a bit of a self-plug, but I was on an Institute of Medicine panel on environmental decision-making under uncertainty, and we actually addressed this in a categorical kind of way. So things like within an adequate margin of safety, buffer language like that, we treated it as, okay, these are tools to address scientific uncertainty and the developing state of scientific knowledge. And there are other tools to address that too. And we mentioned other statutory tools, like, for example, a requirement that an agency revisit, right, a thing. And that's also a tool to deal with scientific uncertainty and developing scientific things. And so we approached it more like a tool kind of toolkit of ways in which Congress and agencies can deal with it. And so, things like, for example, if you're dealing less on a rulemaking thing, but a permit requirement, right? A permit requirement to, reapply in a certain smaller period of time, or to have continual monitoring. These are other ways to deal with scientific uncertainty and continual development. So I think, that's also another way to look at it.
Well, and if you're working at climate, the IPCC reports have got explicit discussions about how they deal with uncertainty. And then it's really useful to go back to, start with the first report, and then you look at the later reports and you see how the threshold, they reach the threshold for greater certainty as they go through the reports as a sort of dynamic process. They're really worth getting the students to dig into, particularly the summaries for policymakers.
So one thought too is that could be an opportunity, like we were talking about earlier, to introduce the students to how people conduct these kind of public health assessments in agencies. And so if you're not looking at a dose response curve from something like carcinogen or something like lead that, just any amount we now know poses risk, same with, PM 2.5, but historically the agencies have used safety factors and like translating what the risk was in the animal studies to the human studies for non-cancer risks. And it's a factor of 10 for variation from another species to humans, and then a factor of 10 within humans because we might be more or less sensitive. And I think that's like a tangible thing that I was kind of surprised going back to the agency after all these years that they're actually still doing that, frankly, because like in the 80s we were doing that. I'm like, oh my God, you're still doing that? So, but I mean, it's something that they actually do use, and I think that's something that people can kind of grasp onto, like, oh, okay, well, we're not rats, and the study was done in rats. So, I mean, this is the best we're doing, I guess, at figuring out whether or not, if it was a risk to them, if it's a risk to us, and then you build in kind of these safety factors. And then the RIA is where you unpack what the cost and benefits are, even if you're not supposed to under that part of the Clean Air Act.
Right.
Look at it because you're supposed to have an adequate margin of safety or an ample margin of safety for toxics. But then that's where the interplay of like, well, that's really interesting. Where does that come into play if you're not really supposed to use that in your decision-making under the statute, right? The other thing you might think about is having the students look at some of the summaries from the KSAC, so the Clean Air Science Advisory Committees. That's like the equivalent of IPCC, but more for criteria air pollutants, and see what they have to say. Sometimes there are minority views that we don't go far enough, or that we're giving the most recent science its due, or not, And so that kind of allows you to incorporate it into the stuff that you're going to have to cover in an environmental law survey course like the Clean Air Act. But it also gets you some of those concepts in without saying, we're going to have a day where we're going to teach you all these concepts and these methods. You can try to get it in when you're dealing with that particular statute.
Thank you. We have, I assume, many more questions to talk about, but no more time to do it. We are almost into where we need to regroup for our affinity group. So Anne's going to tell us all where they are.
Right, I'm gonna. Okay, so we have time for a short break. People can go and grab coffee. We've got cookies and fruit salad to snack on back in the main room there. And then our affinity groups, we're gonna start give you a little more time, start at about 2:35. So we've got 3 different affinity groups. One of them is administrative law, right here in this room. Environmental Law 101 is next door in Oaks Hall, room 110. Climate is back in Yates, our base room, and then Zig Platter's session on environmental law teaching. I'll direct anyone who's attending to that. It's sort of upstairs above the room where we started this morning, the EELCC conference room, for anyone who knows the lay of the land and can help direct people there. So.
And that's about a specific program where students can become teachers to teach environmental law to undergrad students that he's hoping other schools will adopt. So if that's something you're considering for your school, he would love to talk about it.
Yes.
And thank you to our panelists. This was a wonderful discussion.